I acquired a old PET computer, and it was working pretty well except for being generally pretty dirty. And the keyboard in particular was quite a mess. Filthy on the outside, kind of sticky with some sort of residue. I don't know if the person using it before smoked and maybe it was a tar film. Anyway, they were kind of sticky, and the keys didn't all register quite properly. And worse, several of them, actually quite a few of them, would stick down occasionally or all the time, not return, and as long as they were down, they would short out the keyboard matrix and prevent other keys from working. So obviously, if this computer was going to be used at all, the keyboard needed to be restored. And after reading blogs and advice from several Commodore websites, I took the plunge, and this video shows the steps I went through to restore mine. Now, this was done on a PET, but my understanding is the keyboards for the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 and maybe a couple of other models are very comparable, and the same techniques could be used. Now, the first thing to do with any of these before removing the keyboard is to take note of how the keyboard is plugged into the main computer circuit board. On the PET, it's done like this, and on all the PETs I've ever worked on, the cable from the keyboard is just barely long enough to raise the lid up, and if you raise the lid up all the way or try to move the keyboard, you'll yank this connector off, possibly doing some damage. So you want to take a look at it, make sure you know its orientation so you can plug it back in the right way, and also unplug it before you try to remove the keyboard. And before getting going any further, it's a good idea to take some detailed photos of the keyboard so when you pull everything apart, you remember which keys go where. It could be quite a tedious process to try to rediscover that. So before you get any further, it's easy to forget it later on. Do it right now. Take those pictures. On the PET, the keyboard is held in with a row of screws along the bottom of the keyboard and another row along the top edge of the keyboard. And those all get removed at this point. Make sure you support the keyboard when removing the last few screws, because it would be very easy for it to suddenly drop and do some damage to the circuit board. This will be a little less critical on a VIC-20 or C64, but in any case, you want to be careful with it. And then here's the keyboard assembly laying out on my workbench, and I think all of the Commodores had the same general type of arrangement with the cable running off to plug into the main circuit board, and I found that cable to be a real pain. It's just long enough to always be getting in the way and tangling up in things and whipping around when you're moving the keyboard. And I don't have a picture showing it, but eventually I just sort of rolled it up into a fairly tight loop and used a couple of zip ties to hold it that way, and it was a lot more manageable. The keyboard consists of a plastic frame that holds all the keys, and then a circuit board that is on the bottom of the frame and held to the frame with quite a few very tiny screws. At this stage, to go any further, you need to remove all those screws. Make sure you don't lose any of them. The keyboard and the circuit board are springy enough that I think even missing one screw could cause bowing and potential lack of resolution or other problems with certain keys on the keyboard. So be very meticulous and careful storing all these screws. And I think they're all the same size. Certainly they were on my PET, so just be careful with that. At least on the PET, the shift lock key is a separate key switch that is not part of the circuit board assembly, but does snap into the keyboard frame. And that's because it's a maintained switch and not part of the same structure of momentary switches as everything else is. Anyway, those are wired with a couple of separate wires as shown here, and they need to be unsoldered before trying to remove the circuit board. So whether it's before or after you undo all the little screws from the circuit board, you want to address these two wires, and they're only tack soldered on there, so just a little heat from the soldering and they come off. Don't overheat these because you could easily damage that switch and you'd probably have a hard time finding another one like it. The next step is to remove all the key tops, and this really needs to have a special tool. If you try doing it with a screwdriver or something, you'll probably do a lot of damage and, cosmetically and possibly break the stems on the bottom of the keys, which aren't all that strong. and you can't afford to break anything here because you can't get replacements really. So I bought this on Amazon. It was just a few dollars. There's similar ones, but this is a popular one. I think it's WASD or something like that, or WASO. Hard to tell from their logo what the last letter is. Anyway, if you just Google key top remover or key button remover, something like that, you'll find it. And it just is a handle with two stiff wire loops with squared ends. In the first photo, it looks like there's only one loop, but there's two, and they're just really tight up side by side. You spread them apart a little bit, slip it over the key top, push it down until the wire loops are below the bottom of the key top, then twist the tool 45 degrees so it's under the corners of the keys, and then lift straight up, and it should just pop right out. And then you disengage it from the loops and do the next one. Make sure when pulling the tool up and removing the key tops that you do it firmly but with a controlled motion. You don't want to yank it up, because if you do that, as soon as the stem at the bottom of the key top disengages the plunger below it, the spring is going to want to fly off, and you don't want to be losing those springs or damaging them. So lift it up so it's kind of like it's shown in the photo, and then remove it gently and take the spring off and put it safely aside. The space bar is a special case on the keyboard. It doesn't have a normal key top, and obviously it's part of a more elaborate assembly. It has metal brackets on the bottom and a stiff bail or torsion bar that keeps the left and the right moving down at the same amount, because it's really just the one switch in the middle. And that extra mechanism makes the whole bar move smoothly no matter where you push it. But there is a bit of a trick to it. In this photo, you can see right along the top of the horizontal wire, there's a thin strip of black plastic with a couple little wedged protuberances on it. And you need to get a hold of that just with the corner of a small screwdriver, or if you can grab it with a really small needle nose pliers and lift it straight up. It comes out of there, and this other photo shows what it looks like. But that's the first step in removing it. With the keyboard bail wedge removed, lift and rotate the space bar up and expose the spring, lift the spring out, and then, as shown in this picture, you push the bail towards the back of the keyboard. It normally wouldn't go back, but now that that wedge has been removed, it will go back, and once it's back, it disengages the little tabs at the left and the right, and the whole bail will lift up and out, and then the whole space bar is up and separated from the keyboard frame. At this point, you should have a bunch of springs and a pile of key tops. And here's a view of the top of the keyboard frame, very dusty and dirty in this picture. You still see the switch plungers are still in the frame, but over on the left you can see that special shift lock key, which I mentioned before is not really part of the main keyboard assembly. It just sort of snaps into it. And there is two little tabs on the sides that you can push in with a small screwdriver and release it from the frame, and you definitely want to remove it at this stage. I took the coil springs, which are all pretty dusty, and just put them in a little microwave safe freezer tub with warm soapy water, and just let them soak for about an hour, and then took them off and rinsed them thoroughly. Trying to scrub them or anything else would possibly damage them because they're made from fairly fine wire. I didn't want to damage them in any way, so I satisfied myself with just giving them a good soak and then a good rinse under a fairly forceful water stream. And of course, I did it in a sink where if I dropped them, they wouldn't go down the drain. And then I laid them out on a double sheet of paper towel to just dry for a good few hours. For all the key tops, I used a similar approach, obviously a larger dish, and let them soak for a good day, 12 hours or so, in what started out as a good temperature for washing your hands. I don't want it to be hot because I don't know what temperature the plastic might be deformed in any way, so I kept it warm, but definitely not very warm. And of course, it cooled off pretty quickly. Still, I thought it was advantageous. I used the same dishwashing liquid soap, and I used an old soft bristle toothbrush. And after they'd soaked for a few hours, I went in through each one and picked it up and gave it a good brushing on all four sides of the key as well as the top, and then gave them a good thorough rinse. And I had some Tech Wipes, which is a lint-free technical wiping cloth that I then went over each one under the running water and scrubbed it with that as well, because there still was a little film remaining here and there that didn't come off with the toothbrush. So it was almost like, polishing the key surfaces using that. And then, of course, laid them out on some paper towel to dry. And I rotated them after 12 hours because you can get water up inside the keys, and it doesn't always just drain out, and you can't lay the key on a side where the opening is down, so you just require gradual air circulation for all the water to evaporate. I did hasten things a little bit by blowing into them with a compressed air can or an air duster can, but still, I think I ended up leaving them for 2 full days to dry out before doing anything else with them. Note that the Commodore keys, while not the most expensive keyboards out there, certainly, and mechanically very simple, but they end up being pretty reliable, at least for personal use. Maybe they wouldn't hold up to heavy, industrial grade computer use, but they're pretty decent keyboards for the money. And the one nice thing is that the key tops are molded. It's not a decal on the top for the lettering. It's actually a darker plastic molded over white plastic, and the white plastic is molded up through the front face of the key to form the letters and numbers. So you can't remove the legends on the keys by soaking them or working them over with a toothbrush or a cloth, which most modern keys, they just seem to use decals, and I'm not sure what would happen to those if you let them soak like this. Probably just come right off. Now with the keyboard frame flipped over, you can see that every key, except for the shift lock key, which is removed in this picture, every key has a white nylon plunger, and on the end of the plunger is a little, I don't know if it's silicone rubber, but some sort of rubbery, springy dome with a little disc of carbon-coated material on the top, making it conductive. And the plungers just slide up and down inside the key frame, and the plungers have a little tab on each side. One tab is wider than the other, so they are indexed or keyed in there. They can't rotate, and they only go in one way. But they can all be safely removed at this point and set aside. It's a good thing to not grab them by the carbon tips. You want to avoid handling that as much as possible. So I actually just use my fingers to grab the ends of the white plunger on either side of the carbon and lift it out. With all the pieces removed from the keyboard frame itself can be safely cleaned. It's a one-piece structure, although a fairly complicated molding, and there's a lot of little nooks and crannies that can accumulate dirt. So I soaked mine in a sink once again with ivory liquid soap for a couple hours, and then went over it with Q-tips and a soft toothbrush, and then blew most of the water out of it with a can of compressed air or an air duster can, and then finally laid it out on some paper towel one way and then flipped it over again a couple hours each way, make sure it was good and dry. The final thing to clean is the circuit board itself, and of course this has to be handled with care so as not to do it any damage. The keyboard has these little interlaced fingers of gold-plated copper where the carbon pads on the keyboard plungers will come down and push against, and that's what makes the contact. The whole keyboard is laid out as a matrix of horizontal and vertical lines, which are arranged in a way that makes sense to the computer software in the operating system. And it looks like a bit of a rat's nest on the circuit board, but really it's not that complicated. The main thing that needs to be done here is to make sure there's no gunk or built-up carbon or dirt on those little gold pads. So I used some isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips and just gently wiped them and made sure those were good and clean, and then let it dry for a couple minutes. You'll notice in this picture one thing that Commodore did, which I've never seen elsewhere, is that it's really something that should be a double-sided circuit board, but to save money, they used a single-sided circuit board. But then in, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so places where they needed traces that would jump over the other traces, normally you would do this either with jumpers on the other side of the board. They couldn't do that here because it would impact the keyboard frame or get in the way of the plungers or something. Or they could use a double-sided circuit board, which was too expensive. So instead they just glued on these little foil traces that you can see here. They're in a brighter green than the other ones, and they overlay the first set of traces, and they're just sort of glued on, and then there's places where they contact through to the foils on the main circuit board. Very unique, and you don't want to damage these when you're cleaning the board. I'm not sure if they would come off if you got them wet with alcohol, and you definitely don't want to soak this in water, so just be a little bit careful of that. The only other thing that needed cleaning was the carbon pads on the ends of the key plungers. This is a very delicate area, and I used Q-tips with isopropyl alcohol and actually looked at them through a magnifying lens so I could see it clearly, and just very gently wiped them one direction and the other. No digging in, no forceful rubbing, just very light motions with the Q-tip, and made sure that they had no gunk on them or little bits of stuff stuck to them, which many did. Dust and stuff sort of pressed into the ends. I dislodged all of that, and some keys that are used more than others get kind of a shiny surface, and I used just a little more pressure on those with the Q-tip and just rough them up a little bit, I guess, with the Q-tip until they didn't have that glazed surface on the carbon pad, and they all end up looking like this when done. And I also used the Q-tips to wipe around the gray rubbery dome that the carbonized area sits on top of, because that would also accumulate dirt and would kind of stick to that rubbery surface. So I made sure to clean those with a nice wiping action with the head of the Q-tip, or the tip of the Q-tip going around. Up next was reassembly of all the plungers into the keyboard frame. They just drop in. Once again, they are keyed because the two tabs on the plungers are different widths, so it'll only go in one way, and they're all the same, so it doesn't matter which one goes in which hole. And then, of course, the shift lock key has to snap in too before doing anything else. All of these, I don't even know what to call them. I'm just going to call them plungers right now. They all have a slightly wider tab on one side and a narrower tab on the other, although it's not that apparent in the video. The wider tab is on the right, and then that just fits into slots in the keyboard frame, and when you push the key top down, it'll push the plunger here in this fashion, and then the that little gray piece on the end of the plunger is the dome with the carbon pad on the end of it. So that is squishable. I shouldn't really touch it with my finger. So you can see that that pushes in. Then the circuit board gets laid back over all the plungers. Now, if you just lay the keyboard frame down like this, the weight of the frame will push up on the plungers and the circuit board won't want to fit on it. So I actually held the keyboard frame between my knees as I was sitting at my workbench, and therefore the plungers could be hanging down fully and not get in the way of reassembling the keyboard. The keyboard is lined by several little plastic pins sticking up from the keyboard frame. They go through small holes in the circuit board. You have to get those aligned first, and then you can press the circuit board down and reassemble it with all those little screws. Again, be very careful not to strip the plastic. There's not a good way to recover from that damage if you do it, so be very gentle. Make sure they're in firm, but don't overdo it. And then, of course, you have to verify that all the keys still work, or all the key plungers move smoothly at this point before going on to the next step. So right now all of these plungers are sitting down on the circuit board, and all I can do is press the rubber dome slightly, but that's not the way they actually sit on the keyboard. In reality, these will sit up higher like this because the spring under the key top will be pushing it up, and then when you push the key top down, it makes that full transfer to that height. Then the spacebar goes back on. Once again, orient it in the way shown here. It only goes on one way, but you can save some frustration by aligning it this way first, and then you carefully manipulate the horizontal wire of the spacebar torsion bar or bail as shown here, and then once it's dropped down, you pull it a bit forward and the wire slips onto the little tabs. And then notice how the stem on the bottom of the spacebar will align with the slotted top of the plunger, and position the spring in there. Then align the spacebar with the plunger and carefully press them together. I found that this was tricky. I had a hard time getting it lined up quite right so it would go in. You don't want to force it. Once it's aligned right, it should drop in fairly easily. You'd need a bit of force, but don't really crunch it. If it's taking a lot of force, it's probably wrong. Now to lock the space bar into the keyboard frame, that long thin wedge that was removed early needs to be put back in. Notice how it's oriented here. There's the two small wedges on one face of it. Those go forward and they touch the horizontal wire of the keyboard bail. If you do it the other way, then the whole assembly will push against the wire, and that makes too much friction. You just want these two little wedge tabs to push against the wire. So you slip it in there, make sure it's aligned, centered left to right, and just push it down with your fingers till it won't go any further. It should look like it does in this picture. And with that, the space bar is in position, and you can toggle it up and down with your finger, make sure it works smoothly, doesn't stick. Works the same if you push it in the middle or the left or the right. Once the space bar is mounted, all the other keys can go on, and it's simply a matter of referring to the photos you took earlier on, making sure you know which key goes where. And I didn't try to get them in any particular order. I just would grab a key from the pile, identify it, figure out where it goes, put the spring over the top of the plunger, and then stick the stem on the bottom of the key tab into the plunger. Make sure it's aligned nice and straight. If it's a little bit off, it won't want to go in. And then just push it in until it sort of snaps down into position. If you finally get the assembly done and you find one key top is sitting a little high, just mash it down a little more forcefully until all of them are at the same height. With the keyboard fully reassembled, I wanted to make sure that it was actually working with the computer before I went and completely reinstalled it in the computer chassis. So I just sort of laid it on top. With a VIC-20 or a C64, you could lay it next to the open case, but on the PET, it's hard to do that without it damaging something internally. So I just laid it on top of the cutout in the case and fed the cable through and plugged it in temporarily, and then just went through and typed all the keys. I don't need to type them shifted because it's the same key shifted or not, so just went through and make sure everyone registered and registered with the correct symbol, letter, or number. Once all the keys were verified to be working and not sticking, I took the keyboard back off and soldered the 2 wires for the shift lock key. I didn't want to do a solder unsolder too many times on this switch because I've been warned by others on various blogs that the switch would be damaged by too much soldering and unsoldering. So I only wanted to do that when every other key was verified working. Then the only thing remaining to be done is to mount the keyboard back into the case with the row of screws along the top and bottom. And again, this is a very delicate area because it's above the PET circuit board, and it would be very easy to drop it at this stage, and it would certainly do damage to the ICs or the circuit board. And some of these ICs are practically irreplaceable, so you want to be really careful. It wouldn't be a bad idea to lay like a rolled up old towel on top of the circuit board or something. In case you did drop it, it would act like some padding. But then the cables fed down inside and plugged back into the main circuit board, and then the job should be complete.